Thank you for joining us today. My guests are Susan Hawkins and her brother, Peter Robinson. Susan Robinson Hawkins was born in Bethlehem, PA. She came to Pittsburgh in 1970 to begin college at Carnegie Mellon. And I want to point out she was 16 years old as a violin major. She graduated with a degree in psychology, and after 2 jobs in research at CMU and the University of Pittsburgh, she returned to school to become a physician assistant. She worked for the Department of Surgery at St. Francis Hospital, which is now Children's Hospital, and was the first faculty member of physician assistant programs at Duquesne University and at Chatham University, where she was for 24 years, and she is currently faculty emerita. She currently works as a wellness counselor, having maintained a 100-pound weight loss for over 10 years. She's married to Steve Hawkins, an architect in Squirrel Hill, and the former Squirrel Hill columnist for Shady Avenue magazine. She has 4 daughters, a cartoon artist, a piano technician, and rock percussionist, a medical student, and a psychology student. She enjoys cooking, hiking, helping others, playing games, and doing home workouts sponsored by the JCC in Pittsburgh. And for the first time, sharing his story, we are very happy to welcome Susan's brother, Peter Robinson. Peter was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1947. He came to the United States in 1950. He is married and worked as a Salesforce platform administrator and developer. And I am so grateful to both of you for being with us today. So Susan, I'm going to invite you, please, to share your story.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Thanks for the opportunity to do this. And thanks to all of you who are listening. I believe that our parents would be thrilled that we're telling their story. They really didn't have a lot of opportunity to tell their story when they could have. I remember my mother telling me that people didn't want to hear what had happened to her, that when she would try to say anything about her experiences during the Holocaust, people would say, you have to forget all of that. You're in America now, don't think about it. And now, of course, the research is showing that post-traumatic stress disorder is very prevalent among survivors of both the Holocaust and other types of trauma, and that the least helpful thing is to tell people to forget about it. Similarly, our father, I think, really didn't talk much about his experiences. So everything that we're going to share with you are things we've learned piecemeal. I probably don't know as much as, what I don't know is much larger than what I know. And do you have any thoughts about that, about their not talking about it?
Well, that was also part of it for me, that they would not talk, they did not talk about it. And honestly, it was clearly so painful for them. I didn't at any point press them to say more.
I think that's not an unusual experience of children of Holocaust survivors, where you don't want to cause your parents pain, and 2, you really don't want to be in that kind of pain yourself, because seeing your parents in pain is painful. And so there are many shared characteristics. And for those of you who are interested, there's lots of literature that's very good on children of Holocaust survivors. And many of these accounts are at the Holocaust Center in Pittsburgh and are available, that children of Holocaust survivors feel like they have to be really, really good because their parents have suffered so much that they better be just super kids. And I think kids go different ways with it. Some become super achievers, and some just become completely incapacitated by the need to be a super kid.
Yes.
And I think many people can identify with this, not just families of Holocaust survivors, but families that have had any kind of giant trauma. There are families that talk about it, and there are families that don't talk about it. So to go back to their stories, my mother came from a very small town in Hungary called Kuba, and Kuba was at about an hour away from the nearest big city by train, which is Debrecen. She grew up in a house where the business was on the first floor and the family lived on the second floor. Her father was a baker and also made wine and spirits from fruits that grew behind their house. She was very assimilated. People in the town were largely Hungarian Reformed or Catholic and Jewish. So those were kind of the three main religions in the town. And her best friend was not Jewish. She was from a family that only really went, the girls didn't have to go to religious services. They went on the high holidays. She went to dances. And she had a business. She was a seamstress, and that was pretty unusual for the times for a woman to have her own business. I think that was considered somewhat unusual. Hungary was among the last of the countries to have the Jews deported. They were deported largely in 1944. My mother said they just never thought of themselves as not being Hungarian. They were Hungarian, so they really weren't worried that anything bad was going to happen. So when the people in the town were taken away, and it was all in one day, the population of the town has always been around 5,000, which it still is today. The Jews in her town were marched to the train station through the town. And my mother talked about people yelling things at them. They gave some belongings to neighbors to hide for them because they thought they would be coming back. And she just remembers that people who she thought were her neighbors and friends were yelling horrible things, really just terrible things at the people, and how horrible it was to be marched through the streets like that. Is there anything about that you remember?
Again, not that she talked about, other than, that she never considered herself anything other than Hungarian.
And,
I mean, it was the kind of thing, she never spoke Yiddish.
mm-hmm.
She didn't really learn Yiddish until she came to America, and what little she did.
Yeah.
And it was the same kind of thing, I think, when we spoke to Jacob, that he said it was very common. It's like everyone had their Hungarian names.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't necessarily, like my name Peter, that would not be a typically Jewish name, but it wasn't considered anything out of the ordinary.
And in fact, our mother had an uncle named Peter, and her brothers went by Hungarian names, Erne and Miklos. So they also had Hebrew names, but unlike other small towns in Eastern Europe, Yiddish was not it just wasn't really spoken. There were other towns in Hungary where it was different, but in this town it was pretty progressive. So she went to both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen during the war. It's unclear to me because of many things that she said that conflict with each other. Sometimes she talked about sewing clothing for the officers in the concentration camp because she had that skill, that made her valuable, and that's one of the ways that she survived. But I know there was a lot of sexual abuse of prisoners, and there are ways that I think that's also part of her story because of things she said, not directly, but kind of combining comments, side comments she made, and what I've read about life in the concentration camps, I think that certainly is a likelihood that that also happened. She was transferred to Bergen-Belsen from Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen was where she was liberated from. That's my understanding.
Okay, that she never said that. You know, she never said
That wasn't
to
something she said to you.
Mhm.
One of the great mysteries to me is I don't know how she got back to her hometown from Bergen-Belsen. You know, we're talking a long distance, and it wasn't like they gave everybody a bus ticket and said, go home. People had to make their way back, and she arrived back in Kuba long after her one surviving brother. All of her other siblings died in the concentration camp, as well as her parents, as well as her aunt and uncle, as well as her cousins. There was one cousin who survived, two cousins survived and went to Israel, and one brother survived and came back to Kuba. But I later found he got back there much before her. He had already settled back in a little bit by the time my mother got there.
How many siblings did she have? How many siblings did she have?
I think 6.
There were illness in the family, and some of her siblings died before.
But the ones who died, Rosie died in the war, Buncy died in the war, Bergie, and Erner. So 4 siblings died in concentration camps. And then Miklos is the one who came back and became a baker but died young.
Mm-hmm. And I know, you know, like the kinds of things that was hard to hear about. I think, I forget which, may have been Roshi, they were in the camp together.
Her sister.
Yeah. And somehow my mom was in charge of distributing food among the prisoners. So she would always hold some back to give Roshi extra, because Roshi was very sick at that time.
And she had a daughter named Gita. Rosie did. And Rosie wouldn't eat the bread. She would give it to Gita, to her daughter. I remember my mother saying that. So that I had completely blocked out. So I haven't even thought about it.
And it's always, you know, a little bit strange, you know, okay. So other prisoners weren't getting food, so that were getting less so that Rosie could get more. But that's, you know, that was survival in life. And many times I just don't want to know how they survived.
Yeah.
You know.
She came back to Hungary and didn't want to stay there. She really wanted to get out of Hungary. She was very distressed by losing most of her family. And my mother had a boyfriend before the Holocaust. And according to my mother's cousin, in a very difficult conversation, because neither of us had a common language and we were working with dictionaries, that he lost an arm in a motorcycle accident, and that my mother's mother didn't want her to marry him, or she's called him her fiance, but he did not come back from the Holocaust, which is not surprising. And his brother survived, and he was a doctor, came back to Kuba and wanted to marry my mother. And my mother wanted to come to America, and this man did not want to come to America. He wanted to stay in Hungary. So that's how my mother met my father. He said he wanted to come to America. Boom, they came to America. So she met my father in Budapest, is my understanding. And they emigrated to the United States, but they had to first, they got into Austria. They were in a displaced persons camp in Austria. And the travel from Hungary to Austria was secret and illegal, I believe.
Yeah.
You know a little more about that.
This was, I had been born, so about 1947, and a little later, things in Hungary were apparently fairly fluid, and that the communists had taken over, but it wasn't an absolute lockdown yet, you know. So my father continued his business, but people weren't allowed to emigrate. So my understanding is there was some talk that there may have been, you know, that the secret police were looking for him, and so he had to sort of like keep low. But it didn't sound like anything like a manhunt. But they were, and then when they decided to leave, they just put anything that they could fit into my baby carriage, put me on top of it and just walked out as if they were, going for a walk. But they had arrangements with a group of people to head for the Austrian border.
And my mother told me that she left food cooking on the stove. She tried to leave everything as if they were coming home. And we heard the story told that my brother was crying and that people wanted them to leave him behind, and that they had drugged him, which was not unusual to try to keep babies quiet when you were trying to escape, and that he was crying, and that was a fear, but obviously they did not leave him behind. And they emigrated to the United States on a troop ship, is my understanding. From what that's what she told me. But
don't remember. I mean, we were in Austria for about almost 3 years.
Right, and you know more about that than I do.
So at a EP camp near Salzburg. That I probably don't remember much of Hungary, but could have been a troop ship. I don't remember it as that, but I don't remember. I only vaguely remember being seasick. That's
Do you remember anything about the DP camp?
Little bit. We had a small sort of individual little rooms. I remember there was a giant bathhouse for, because there was no individual. And I don't remember much more than that, other than when I came to this country, I spoke German, not Hungarian.
Because Austria, you would have spoken German.
Well, I guess, but I'm not entirely sure why, since my parents would have spoken Hungarian among themselves.
Well, and my mother tells the story of how Peter wouldn't eat anything, so the seasick part would fit, and that she paid $5, the equivalent of $5 for one banana. So, because that was one of the only foods that he would eat. And she also told the story that he was coughing, and they did an x-ray, and they were worried that he might have tuberculosis, which would have made him ineligible to come into the United States, and that she stole him out of the infirmary, and that it was so chaotic on the ship that they found them. And that sounds like something our mother would have done. And so that's another piece of the lore. So that kind of takes us to the United States. My father has a very different story. My father is from Munkac, in which then was Czechoslovakia, now is the western part of the Ukraine, very near the Hungarian border. And Munkac is one of the areas, it's now called Mukachevo. And so it has been under Russian rule. It's been under Czech rule. It's been under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's really been contested ground. It's a very fertile area. And so most people who lived in that area, including my father, spoke multiple languages. So people would speak German and Yiddish and Hungarian and Russian and sometimes other languages as well. And our father was actually in the Czech army, and I have a very broken picture of him in his army uniform. So he was a survivor also. Both of our parents, clearly, it's not accidental that they survived. They had survivor personalities. So when they asked him, so he went into the army, I think it was the early 30s, and they asked him what skills he had, and he told them he was a cook. Now, he had never cooked a day in his life, but he said, I knew that if I got assigned to a kitchen, I'd be near the food, so I wasn't going to go hungry. And he was absolutely right. So while in the army, he learned how to cook. And our father did cook when we were growing up, and he was very proud of the fact that he could cook. But that's the kind of survivor mentality that he had. So he actually was married. He had a wife and 3 children. I believe the ages of his children at the time of the Holocaust in Munkac were around, I want to say 7 10 and 13, because his son was bar mitzvah. And then there was one daughter, there were two daughters and a son. So they would be our half siblings. In his town, in Munkac, had a huge Jewish population, 30,000, 40,000 people. It was very, very large. And my father was in business. He sold fruits, vegetables, dried things, nuts, things like that.
Delicatessen.
Yeah. And, but he was a traveling salesperson. So he knew a lot of people, and a policeman told him that they were going to be taking away the Jewish men in town. And this, we're talking a lot of men. This would be a lot of people. So he went and hid. And some of the things I remember him saying are that he hid in a hospital laundry chute, because I remember him saying, dirty linens were coming down on him. And also that he hid in the woods. Do you have any memory of things he talked about?
Not those, no.
So those were things that he said to me. And he would make visits back into town. He would sneak back into town to check on his wife and children, and then sneak back out again, because no one thought they would ever take women and children. Like that, it wasn't even a thought in anybody's mind. So he assumed they were safe as long as they stayed at home. And one time when he came back, they were gone. And indeed, they all were killed. I don't know what concentration camp they went to. I really don't know anything. That was a really hard thing for me when I found that out. It made me feel very unsafe. Even though, I think he lived with a tremendous guilt, a tremendous feeling of failure as a father, and I felt like, wow, having your parents with you doesn't make you safe, or something like that. Just a general feeling of unsafety. And in fact, I think our mother propagated that, because I was the first one born in the United States, and I was very proud of that. So I would, say, oh, that couldn't happen. We're in America. Oh, Mom, you just don't know. We're in America. And she would say things like, you just wait and see. You think nothing like this could happen in America. And of course, with all the things that are going on in the country right now, she turns out to get to be right, that violent things can happen to people who are innocent in America. But in the late 50s, early 60s America that I was growing up in, it was like rah rah, zis boom bah, nothing bad is ever going to happen. How was that for you?
Well, let's see. I think, well, first off, a little bit of context in that when they came here, I think they very deliberate, like one of the obvious things would have been to stay in New York, where they arrived. But I mean, they did go into Pennsylvania because we had my father's brother who had left before the war and stayed there for a while. And then they moved to our parents moved to Bethlehem. You hadn't been born yet.
I know, I wasn't born yet.
Even though you're older, right? Because there was a business available there. And there was actually a moderately sized Jewish community there already. Which for my father's, but the thing was, not only few survivors, there were very few Jews who weren't who weren't born in the U.S. I mean, I think for myself, it was a real anomaly. There were almost nobody, certainly no one my age who would have been not even Jewish. I mean, just like having been born in another country.
Well, I would say Puerto Rico, Bethlehem did have immigrants at that time from Puerto Rico. No, I know, but in terms of feeling different, like parents who don't speak the language being different, but it was a different.
Right. So we were, I have a feeling they somehow wanted to sort of keep us isolated from more of a survivor community, because it would have been a different way growing up with whatever few of the relatives we had.
Well, when I talked to people from Pittsburgh who are children of survivors, they had a community, and they talk about how the kids could talk together about how weird their parents were. We had nobody to talk to about how weird our parents were.
Right. And I think they were, even within that context of the Jewish community, they were weird.
Right, because there were very few people who didn't speak English well. There were
they were all native born.
Right.
I mean, a few old timers, but everyone else was native born and very can't say assimilated, but again, the same kind of thing of being very comfortable in America. They wouldn't really want to hear about things about the Holocaust because it's not relevant to them.
Mm-hmm. I would say they were shut down if they wanted to talk about it in Bethlehem. They didn't have a listening.
They wanted to talk. I couldn't tell, but if they did want to.
If they did, well, Mom had said a couple times that, people didn't want to hear it. So I think that was pretty much everywhere she went.
Mm-hmm.
She would.
And if you notice, we talked very little about my dad because he said even less.
He said a lot less.
He said even less. So we have very few stories from the time of the war.
Right.
Just to give him his say, he was again in the politics of the time. He was a very passionate Czech because he grew up under the Masaryk government in the 30s, which was an extremely liberal, progressive, semi-socialist kind of regime. Jews were very well protected then. I mean, there was just a lot of freedoms. He would be saying, Americans don't know what freedom is. That you had to have lived in Czechoslovakia under Masaryk to know what real freedom is.
And he was very political. He watched the news every night. He read the Jewish Forward paper,
which was
cover to cover.
Which was again different from, because in the time of that, even though he was religious, there was a religious Yiddish newspaper, I forget what it was called, and the Forward, which had originally started as a socialist newspaper. But he always read.
He read that Forward. Cover to cover, and he read the local paper, and he watched the news, and he could name congressmen and representatives, and he knew more about politics than the average native-born American, which doesn't say much, but I mean, he really knew a lot, and I think, so now I have guilt about not appreciating how bright he was because of all the embarrassment I had at their accent, and, that they were my parents, and they were old. That was the other thing.
And he was different. Old. He
was 52 when I was born. Mm-hmm. That was back then. Nobody's parents were 52. People's grandparents were 52.
Right. And also the other things besides, he had less English than our mother did.
Mm-hmm.
He never learned how to drive.
Right. He never learned how to drive.
It was like, that was part of it, growing up. I remember, like days, weekends in our town, every dad was out there working on the car. This was just like the local thing. You look down the street and everyone was out there under the hood, diddling the van. He wouldn't even know how to open the hood.
He barely knew how to open the door. I would say my mother was a much more secular Jew. After the war, I don't think he was that religious.
Before, what he had told me was that he had wanted to go to a secular school. First, he had lost his father very early. Father died they had a store. His father had a heart attack and died when he was fairly young. And his mother was very, very religious, and so she kept fighting against his getting a secular education. But he had wanted to go to a secular school, the gymnasium, and he said that he had gotten admission, but that was at the point at which they had stopped Jews from being able to travel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Timing is everything. So that their differences were pronounced in terms of what they liked to do, in terms of what they thought was valuable. I think my father was moving more in a religious direction. My mother was moving away from a religious direction. And there was a lot of conflict about how we should be raised. Because here we are, these children, we're in America, we're being raised as Americans, but we were in a community where the Jews were very assimilated. There was a Jewish community center in Bethlehem, and both of us spent a lot of time there.
Yeah, it was quite substantial and very, very well maintained. I mean, it was having more experience now, it was amazingly well
it was
situated in extensive schools, activities, organizations.
And we both took part a fair amount in activities.
But somehow very American.
It was very American. And was, I would say not unlike the JCC here, but it just had a really strong sense of community, yet we were still different. There were just not kids at Hebrew school with our subset of experiences. And I'll give you an example. So when I got bat mitzvahed, I was the first person in my family to get bat mitzvahed. And that was considered a big deal. Not just in my family, but in the community. Girls were not bat mitzvahed. They were confirmed, but not bat mitzvahed. But I wanted to be bat mitzvahed. I think our father was very proud of the fact that I wanted to learn and do all this stuff. So when it came time to have the kiddush, I wanted to have American food. I wanted stuff from the local bakery the way all the other kids had for their bar bat mitzvahs. My mother and her friend baked Hungarian pastries, which I was really embarrassed about, except that at the bat mitzvah, that's what got eaten, were all the things that my mother and her friend made, and all the store-bought stuff was left there. So that's just a funny little story of the conflict of growing up a little bit embarrassed about the background.
Mm-hmm.
And just a couple of the other things that I have learned were shared experiences, but I thought were weird when I was growing up, was that everybody left doors open all the time. Bedroom doors were open, bathroom doors were open. Every door was open. And I didn't even know that was weird till I went to other people's houses and I went to the bathroom and left the door open, and they thought I was insane. And it was so humiliating and so embarrassing to find out that what was a common practice in our house was not a common practice anywhere that I knew of. So that's where I would say my first shame of my family was. And I've since learned that this is a very common experience of Holocaust survivors, that you needed to know where everybody was all the time. And if you couldn't account for people, it was a big problem. So if I went somewhere and I wasn't home when I said I was going to be, it wasn't just, hey, you're late. It was, oh my God, we thought you had died. And they really meant it. It wasn't, that was in their world, people who disappeared. And you didn't see them again. And that was really hard. Did you feel like that too?
Oh, yeah. It was the thing with the doors and just the constant fear.
Yeah. So that was very pervasive. And how long that lasted, and to just show how intergenerational this is. And this is one of the stories that Becky, the cartoon artist, really liked, that she heard me say, is that after I got married and my husband and I were living in Squirrel Hill and we had bought a house, and Steve went down to the basement, and when he came up from the basement, I said, why didn't you tell me you were going to the basement? And he looked at me like I was completely insane. But that was a holdover, like you need to know where your peeps are all the time. And I didn't even realize that I was doing it. And that's just the way that I was raised, is that you account for people.
Oh, yeah. I remember times when Emily was visiting us.
That's our second daughter.
And she went out for a walk and said she'd be back in an hour. And when she wasn't back in an hour, I just freaked. I had no way of reaching her, and
that was before cell phone.
Well,
before we had cell phone.
Before we had cell phone. But yeah, it's you always know that something can happen.
Yeah. And I know that many people fear for their children, so I don't, but it's different. It's not fear like they got hit by a car. It's the fear like somebody took them and, did bad things because they're Jewish. It wasn't even just, it was just like a gigantic world.
So I have to say it was just like fear in general.
Yeah.
Because I think, again, from my experience, it was like not feeling like we were part of that Jewish community. I didn't feel that was any safety. In fact, because I was at the point at which I went to Israel for a year, on a year course after high school, and I didn't feel, that sort of this was it was very much an in-between, I didn't feel Jewish in the way that it felt like that was Jewish there or that it was in America.
Or you went and stayed with our cousins there, my mother's cousin, our mother's
And again,
cousin.
it was, and anyone who was directly involved with, with the Holocaust, there was so much that I didn't want to touch it. I mean, an interesting thing, when I was, while I was there, we were on a kibbutz and we stayed, each one of us was sort of assigned a family there that we could sort of like interact with. And the person there was, he had been a conductor, like a musical conductor in Czechoslovakia. In fact, he had studied under Mahler, but which would have been fun, really interesting for me. But again, I just sort of drew back.
Because he was a survivor?
Right. And also, you could just feel the pain. I think it was more because other families that I stayed there, I was so acutely aware of the amount of trauma they were in. It wasn't even anything they said. It's just like you could recognize the pain immediately.
Which might lead into why so many Jewish people go into helping professions. I think children of survivors are exquisitely in tune with people's pain because they saw it around them growing up. And there certainly are a lot of Jewish people represented in the helping professions, and that makes perfect sense. But I had an opposite reaction when I moved to Squirrel Hill. I went to Carnegie Mellon, and then Steve and I moved to Squirrel Hill after graduation. And I felt very safe being in Squirrel Hill. I had never lived anywhere where there were so many Jewish people around where I could walk. Well, we could walk to the Jewish Community Center, but that wasn't where the Jews lived when we were growing up. All the Jews had moved to the better part of town. All the assimilated Jews had moved across the railroad tracks. We were on the wrong side of the tracks. But in Squirrel Hill, it just felt very comforting that there were all different kinds of Jews. But interestingly, I still have that between experience where, for example, the Jewish people on our street tell people we're not Jewish, even though we are Jewish, but we're not Orthodox. And so they tell their children that we're not Jewish. So, it's just there's still a funny way of belonging, not belonging. But that's what's wonderful about a place like the JCC, because there's enough variety of people that you can find your peeps there. So back to how I found out more about my family. My husband had traveled in Europe prior to our meeting. And he kept talking about taking a trip to Hungary, just as part of travels. So we saved money, and in 1979, we made a trip. We started in Israel, and actually our mother went to Israel with us, which was wonderful because that's how we got to talk to the cousin from her hometown, actually two different cousins. One very religious, living in Petach Tikva in a very Orthodox community. The other cousin living in Budapest, a completely secular life, part of the Communist Party, very, proud of the fact that he thought Jews were treated just like anyone else, which of course later would not turn out to be true. But at that moment, it looked like communism was good for the Jews. So we went to my mother's hometown and we met her friend that I mentioned earlier, her good friend Margot, who I have pictures of, both from my mother's youth as well as when I went back to visit. And Margot and her husband, Bundy, had us over at their house. We think our memory was a couple of nights. And they took us to see all these places that my mother had seen, her school, the swimming pool, the little amusement park, the town square. And it was really wonderful, her house. And when we went to the house, the people who were living there were very suspicious and a little unfriendly. We just wanted to come in and see the house. I later learned that people in the town were very afraid of Jews coming back and claiming their parents' property or their family's property. And in fact, it was their property. But when they came back after the war, none of the things that they had given neighbors to hide were given back to them. My mom said there were things like people would say, "Why didn't Hitler finish the job?" Or "We never thought you were coming back. We weren't expecting you to come back." So it wasn't exactly a warm welcome. But one of the things I noticed in '79 was that she didn't introduce us to anybody, not a single soul. And at that time, I was in my 20s. It just didn't click that, wait a minute, how come I'm not meeting any of the people that my mom knew growing up? So it just didn't hit me at that time. That's all I can say is it didn't occur to me, why aren't we meeting anyone? So we had always hoped to go back again. And 3 years ago, we decided to make a trip to Hungary and to Munkacs, where my father was from. At the time, in '79, you couldn't even get into Russia. So it wasn't even a thought of ours to go to Munkacs. But this time, it was possible. So